thinks it's watching an oil crisis, and on the surface, that makes sense. Energy markets are chaos. Governments across Europe and Asia are holding emergency meetings, and all of it traces back to one place, a narrow strip of water called the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it, which makes it the single most important choke point on the planet. And the consensus is clear. If something goes wrong here, the global economy breaks. But here's what nobody is telling you. That's only half the story. Because oil shocks don't hit the world equally. They never have. While some economies get crushed, others quietly benefit. And understanding which side you're on is what separates panic from positioning. Most people still think this plays out like it did 20 years ago. Instability in the Middle East triggers an oil shock, which hammers the U.S. economy. And for a long time, that was true. 20 years ago, the United States imported roughly 60% of its total petroleum consumption. So, when global supply got disrupted, the impact was immediate. Prices spiked, inflation surged, the economy hit pause. It was a simple linear relationship, but that version of the world is gone. Because over the past 2 decades, something changed. New drilling techniques unlocked massive shale reserves across the United States. Production boomed. And the United States didn't just reduce its dependence on foreign oil, it flipped the entire script. Today, the United States is the largest oil producer on the planet, which means the old narrative is completely outdated. The United States is no longer on the same side of the trade. So the question becomes, who actually is exposed? And this is where the real story begins. Because most of the oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz isn't going to the United States, only about 2.5% of it is. The vast majority is heading to Asia, specifically China, India, Japan, and South Korea. Together, those four countries account for roughly 75% of all the oil flowing through the strait. So, when people say a disruption here will shock the global economy, they're not wrong, but they're missing something critical. It's an asymmetric shock, and it does not hit everyone equally. For the United States, a disruption is mostly a price problem. Oil is globally priced, so if supply tightens anywhere, prices rise everywhere. That hurts, but it's manageable. For Asia, it's a completely different situation because it isn't just a price problem, it becomes a supply problem. And those are very different things. Higher prices slow you down, losing access to your energy supplies when things start to break. Factories slow, energy gets rationed, production stalls, same event. Completely different consequences. This is where the story shifts from crisis to opportunity. Because when supply tightens and prices rise, it creates winners and losers. Higher prices don't just hurt, they also generate revenue for producers and exporters. And the United States just happens to be the world's largest oil producer, which means the same shock creating global pain is simultaneously stimulating parts of the U.S. economy. But oil is only half the story, because there's a second layer almost everyone is overlooking: natural gas. The Middle East is one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world. And just like oil, a massive portion flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the entire global supply. Countries like Qatar and the UAE send over 90% of their LNG exports through the strait. So, if the strait gets disrupted, it isn't just oil markets that tighten, gas markets tighten too. And once again, this is where the United States shows up. Because over the past decade, the United States has quietly become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. One region loses supply, another steps in to sell it. Scarcity doesn't just create risk, it creates opportunity. So, if the disruption is quietly giving the United States leverage, who is the biggest loser? The answer is China. But this is where it gets complicated. Because China saw this coming. They've spent years diversifying suppliers, building strategic reserves, and expanding imports from Russia, Brazil, and Venezuela. But even with those safeguards in place, they haven't eliminated the risk. They've only delayed it. China is the largest importer of oil in the world. They consume around 15 to 16 million barrels per day. Roughly 11 million of those are imported, and a massive portion comes from the Middle East flowing directly through the Strait of Hormuz. In the short term, China can probably absorb the shock. In the medium term, they start drawing down reserves. But if the disruption lasts long enough, it stops being an inconvenience and becomes a structural problem. Because China doesn't just use energy, it runs on it. Manufacturing, exports, industrial output, the entire core of China's economy depends on a constant flow of energy. Disrupt that flow and the pressure builds fast, which brings us to the part of the story almost nobody is talking about. Because if you zoom out, something about this whole situation looks strange. Not the conflict itself. Conflicts happen all the time in the Middle East, but the timing. Because right as tensions around the Strait of Hormuz started escalating, something else was happening. Trade negotiations between the United States and China were reaching a critical point. Tariffs, technology restrictions, supply chain decoupling. For years, the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies has been quietly unraveling. And maybe that's where the truth in this conflict actually lives. Because maybe negotiations aren't just about finding solutions. Maybe they're about leverage. And leverage comes from pressure, economic pressure, market pressure, energy pressure. When you look at the whole situation through that lens, the Strait of Hormuz stops looking like an energy story and starts looking like a geopolitical chess move between the two largest economies on Earth. Because if one country can tolerate the shock while the other feels structural pressure from it, then the shock itself becomes the weapon. Which means the Strait of Hormuz might not just be a choke point for oil, it might be a choke point for power. And now, you know how the oil crisis affected everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe. It only takes a second and goes a long way. Stay tuned.